January 17, 1940, North Atlantic, 58 degrees north, 12 degrees west. The sky hung low and colorless, a ceiling of iron pressing down upon water the shade of cold steel. Captain Lieutenant Werner Hartmann stood in the conning tower of U-47, his gloved hands gripping the Spraylick railing as the submarine rolled through 15-foot swells. Salt encrusted his beard. His eyes, red-rimmed from sleeplessness and diesel fumes, scanned the horizon, a flat, empty line where gray met gray. They had been at sea for 19 days. In that time, they had seen 7 Allied merchant ships pass beyond their narrow field of vision, each one a missed opportunity, each one a small death of morale. The ocean was vast. The convoys were ghosts. And the waiting, the endless, maddening waiting, gnawed at every man aboard like hunger. Hartmann descended the ladder into the control room where the air was thick and sour, where 28 men lived in a steel tube 44 meters long, breathing the same recycled breath, wearing the same oil-stained clothes, sleeping in shifts on damp bunks that smelled of mildew and old sweat. He looked at his navigator, a pale young man named Fisher who had been violently seasick for the first week and now simply looked hollow. "Anything?" Hartmann asked. Fisher shook his head. The hydrophone operator, his headset clamped over ears that had listened to the emptiness of the ocean for hundreds of hours, said nothing. There was nothing to say. The Atlantic was winning. This was not what they had been promised. When war came in September of 1939, the German Kriegsmarine had just 57 operational U-boats. Of these, only 22 were Type VII or Type IX ocean-going submarines capable of operating in the Atlantic. The rest were coastal boats, training vessels, or submarines undergoing repair. Admiral Karl Dönitz, commander of the U-boat arm, had calculated that he needed 300 submarines to successfully strangle Britain's supply lines, 300 boats operating in coordinated wolf packs, overwhelming convoy defenses through sheer numbers, cutting the island nation off from the food, fuel, and materials that sustained it. 300 boats could win the war. He had 57. It was like being asked to drain an ocean with a teaspoon. The mathematics were brutal and unforgiving. At any given time, 1/3 of the U-boat fleet was in port for maintenance and resupply. 1/3 was in transit to or from the operational area. Only 1/3 was actually on station, hunting. In January of 1940, this meant perhaps 7 or 8 submarines were prowling the convoy routes at any one time. 7 boats, to cover an ocean that stretched 3,000 miles from east to west and 1,000 miles from north to south. The odds of encountering a convoy by chance were astronomical. The odds of being in the right position to attack were worse. A submarine could patrol for weeks and see nothing but empty water and empty sky. And so they waited. The young men who crewed these submarines had joined the Kriegsmarine with images in their minds, images drawn from the previous war, from the legendary exploits of commanders like Otto Weddigen and Lothar von Arnold de la Perrière, men who had sent hundreds of thousands of tons of Allied shipping to the bottom. They had imagined themselves as modern knights, as hunters prowling the sea lanes, as the sharp edge of Germany's revenge against the British blockade that had starved their father's generation. They had imagined action, purpose, victory. Instead, they found boredom punctuated by mechanical failure and the constant, grinding discomfort of submarine life. They found condensation dripping from the overhead pipes, forming puddles in the bilges that sloshed with every roll. They found bread that turned green with mold after the first week, sausages that grew a white fur of fungus, water that tasted of rust and chemicals. They found the suffocating heat of the diesel engines when running on the surface, the bone-penetrating cold when submerged and conserving battery power. They found the acrid smell of unwashed bodies, the constant dampness that rotted their clothes and made their skin break out in rashes and sores. They found exhaustion. They found each other's company becoming unbearable. They found doubt. Hartmann had been a submariner for 6 years. He had learned to live with the discomfort, had made peace with the claustrophobia, had trained himself to sleep in 4-hour increments and wake instantly alert. But even he felt the weight of the emptiness. Every day without a sighting was a day closer to having to return to port with empty torpedo tubes and nothing to show for the patrol but depleted fuel tanks and exhausted men. Every sunset was a small defeat. The ocean mocked them with its vastness, but something was about to change, something that would transform the empty Atlantic into a killing ground. On February 12, 1940, U-33 was detected and depth-charged by British destroyers in the Firth of Clyde. The submarine was severely damaged and forced to surface. As the crew abandoned ship, British sailors from HMS Gleaner raced to board the stricken U-boat before it sank. In the captain's cabin they found documents, code books, weather ciphers, and most critically, rotor settings for the Enigma machine. The British had been reading German naval communications intermittently since the beginning of the war, but these captured materials provided crucial confirmation of the methods being used. It was a small breach, quickly closed by German cipher changes, but it was a beginning. The real transformation, however, came not from intelligence but from German innovation born of desperation. Admiral Dönitz understood that his handful of submarines could not possibly cover the Atlantic effectively if they operated alone. The ocean was simply too large, the convoys too small and scattered. A single U-boat might patrol for an entire month without making contact, but if U-boats could be concentrated, if they could share information, if one boat could call in others when a convoy was found, then their effectiveness could be multiplied exponentially. The wolf pack was not a new idea. It had been theorized in the years between the wars, but theory was one thing, execution was another. The problem was communication. A submerged U-boat could not transmit or receive radio signals. A surfaced U-boat could communicate, but only in short bursts before risking detection by enemy radio direction finding equipment. And the radios themselves were unreliable, their range limited by atmospheric conditions and the height of the antenna above the water. Weather in the North Atlantic was notoriously foul. Storms and heavy cloud cover were the norm rather than the exception. Coordinating multiple submarines across hundreds of miles of ocean required near-perfect communication. In early 1940, they didn't have it, but they learned. Through the late winter and early spring of 1940, German naval communications specialists refined their procedures. U-boat commanders developed a standardized reporting format that could convey position, course, speed, and composition of an enemy convoy in a brief transmission lasting less than 90 seconds. Encryption protocols were tightened. Radio operators were drilled until they could encode and transmit contact reports almost reflexively. And crucially, the number of operational U-boats began to increase. By June of 1940, with the fall of France, Germany gained access to Atlantic ports at Brest, La Pallice, Saint-Nazaire, Lorient, and Bordeaux. U-boats no longer had to make the dangerous journey around the north of Scotland to reach their patrol areas. They could sail directly into the Atlantic. Transit time was cut by as much as 10 days, more boats on station, longer patrols, greater coverage. The mathematics began to shift. A convoy sighted by one U-boat was now a convoy hunted by 6, by 8, by 10. The lone wolf became a pack. In October of 1940, convoy SC-7, 35 merchant ships bound from Sydney, Nova Scotia to Liverpool, was detected by U-48 south of Iceland. Captain Lieutenant Heinrich Bleichrodt transmitted his contact report and began shadowing the convoy, staying just beyond visual range, periodically surfacing to update the convoy's position and course. Over the next 18 hours, 6 more U-boats converged on the convoy's track. They did not attack immediately. They gathered like sharks drawn by blood in the water, assembling in the darkness, waiting for nightfall. The night of October 18 was moonless and overcast. The U-boats attacked on the surface, where they were faster than the convoy's escort vessels and nearly invisible in the darkness. Low, sleek shapes lost against the black water, their conning towers barely clearing the wave tops. They infiltrated the convoy columns, firing torpedoes at point-blank range into the sides of freighters and tankers that loomed above them like steel cliffs. Explosions ripped the night apart. Ships broke in half, their backs shattered by the massive detonations. Boilers exploded. Fuel oil ignited. Men were thrown into water that was near freezing, where they would live for perhaps 10 minutes before hypothermia stopped their hearts. Convoy SC-7 lost 20 ships in 2 nights of attacks, 40% of the convoy, over 80,000 tons of shipping sent to the bottom. 3 days later, Convoy HX-79 lost 12 ships to another wolf pack. The Allied sailors began to call it the happy time. For the U-boat crews, it was precisely that. After months of empty patrols and fruitless searching, they were suddenly finding targets everywhere. More than that, they were finding targets that were inadequately defended. In the fall of 1940, the Royal Navy had fewer than 200 destroyers and corvettes available for escort duty. Many were assigned to defend against the threatened German invasion of Britain. Others were tied down in the Mediterranean. The escorts assigned to Atlantic convoys were spread desperately thin, often just 2 or 3 warships trying to protect 30 or 40 merchant vessels spread across 10 square miles of ocean. The geometry was impossible. A convoy was like a herd of cattle being guarded by 2 sheep dogs. The wolves had only to be patient, and the wolves were learning to hunt together. Aboard U-99, Captain Lieutenant Otto Kretschmer had developed the tactics that would make him the highest-scoring U-boat ace of the war. He attacked from inside the convoy columns, where the merchant ships masked his presence from the escorts. He fired his torpedoes at close range, often less than 500 meters, where it was almost impossible to miss. He fired single torpedoes rather than spreads, conserving his ammunition, making each shot count. He was methodical, precise, relentless. In 10 months, from September 1940 to March 1941, Kretschmer sank 44 Allied ships totaling over 250,000 tons. His crew called him Silent Otto for his calm demeanor. The British called him something else, but it was not just skill or tactics, it was the system. The Wolf Pack transformed submarine warfare from a game of chance into a science of predation. When U detected convoy HX-72 on September 20, 1940, Captain Lieutenant Heinrich Lieb did not attack immediately. He transmitted the convoy's position and then shadowed it for 24 hours while 3 more U-boats converged on the target. They attacked together. The convoy lost 11 ships. When U-93 found convoy SC-11 on November 24, it called in 2 sister boats. 8 ships sunk. When U-103 intercepted convoy HG-53 on February 9, 1941, 5 U-boats responded to the contact report. 9 ships sunk. The pattern was clear. The pattern was devastating. Allied merchant seamen began sailing in convoys knowing that the odds were worse than even that they would complete their voyage. Insurance rates for transatlantic cargo shipments became astronomical. Some ships sailed without insurance because none was available at any price. The men who crewed these vessels, British, Canadian, Norwegian, Dutch, Polish, Greek, went to sea knowing they might not return, knowing that if their ship was torpedoed in mid-Atlantic, their chances of rescue were minimal, knowing that death would likely come from exposure and hypothermia long before drowning. They went anyway, they had to. Britain was an island. Without imports, it would starve. Without oil, its war machine would grind to a halt. The convoys had to get through, and the U-boats suddenly seemed to be everywhere. It was not that there were so many U-boats. Even at the height of the happy time, there were rarely more than a dozen boats on station simultaneously, but concentration made them seem infinite. A convoy might sail for 5 days without seeing a periscope or a torpedo wake, lulling its escorts into a false sense of security. Then, in a single night, it would be hit by 4 or 5 U-boats attacking from multiple directions simultaneously. The escorts would race from one explosion to the next, dropping depth charges on fleeting sonar contacts, firing star shells into the darkness. But they were always reacting, always behind, always too few. By the time they converged on one U-boat, the others had already fired and melted away into the night. It was like fighting shadows. The psychological impact was immense. For the U-boat crews, success bred confidence, and confidence bred aggression. They began taking greater risks, pressing attacks even in the presence of escorts, surfacing in broad daylight when they had previously attacked only under cover of darkness. They transmitted their contact reports in longer bursts, adding details about escort dispositions and defensive tactics. They lingered on the surface to watch their victims sink, photographing the death throes of burning tankers for intelligence purposes. Some commanders kept scoreboards in their control rooms, tallying tonnage sunk with chalk marks on the bulkhead. There was an almost sporting quality to it, a sense that they were winning not just battles but the war itself. For the Allied sailors, the inverse was true. Every sunrise brought relief. They had survived another night. Every sunset brought dread. The U-boats hunted in darkness. Men slept in their clothes with life jackets close at hand. They learned to recognize the sound of a torpedo impact, a deep, hollow boom quite different from the crack of a breaking wave against the hull. They learned what happened when a ship loaded with aviation fuel was hit, the instant, all-consuming fireball that left nothing behind but an oil slick and floating debris. They learned that cold water killed faster than fire, and that drowning was perhaps the kindest of the deaths available to them. The symbol of the wolf pack was the convoy scattering. When a convoy came under sustained attack, when the escorts were overwhelmed, when ships were being hit faster than the remaining vessels could maneuver, the convoy commodore would sometimes issue the order to scatter, every ship for itself. It was an admission of defeat. A convoy existed to concentrate defensive resources. A scattered convoy was 40 individual targets, undefended, each one desperately trying to outrun or hide from an enemy that could move faster and see farther in the darkness. The scatter order was a death sentence for some, a salvation for others. It was pure chaos, pure terror. In November of 1940, convoy HX-84 scattered after its sole escort. The armed merchant cruiser HMS Jervis Bay sacrificed itself trying to fend off the German pocket battleship Admiral Scheer. 5 merchant ships were sunk in the subsequent hunt. In February of 1941, convoy HG-53 scattered after repeated wolf pack attacks. 9 ships lost. In April, convoy SC-26 scattered. 10 ships sunk. The pattern repeated itself throughout the dark winter of 1940-1941. The U-boats were winning, but they were also learning something unexpected. When Oberleutnant Sir C. Klaus Bargston brought U-563 into Lorient after a patrol in March of 1941, he and his crew were greeted as heroes. They had sunk 4 ships totaling 28,000 tons. The dockside was crowded with naval personnel, newsreel cameramen, and military bands. The crew descended from their submarine looking like ghosts, gaunt, unshaven, their eyes hollow from exhaustion, their uniforms stiff with salt and diesel oil. They were given hot showers, fresh uniforms, and were sent immediately to rest houses in the countryside where they could sleep in real beds and eat real food. For 2 weeks, they would be relieved of all duties. They would be pampered, celebrated, and then they would go back to sea. During those 2 weeks, Bargston talked with other commanders who had recently returned from patrol. They shared stories, compared notes on tactics, discussed technical problems with torpedoes and equipment. And in these conversations, a strange note of disquiet began to emerge. The wolf pack worked. The kills were mounting. The tonnage figures were spectacular, but something was also changing. The convoys were getting stronger. Not in numbers of escorts, those were still stretched desperately thin, but in quality, in sophistication, in technology. The new corvettes being commissioned were equipped with improved sonar, ASDIC sets that could detect a submerged U-boat at ranges up to 2,500 meters. The escorts were being fitted with radar sets that could detect a surface submarine at night, negating the U-boat's greatest advantage. Most concerning of all, some convoys were now accompanied by long-range patrol aircraft, Sunderland flying boats and American-built Catalinas, that could spot a surfaced U-boat from miles away and force it to dive, disrupting its ability to shadow the convoy and transmit contact reports. The technological race was on, and Germany was beginning to fall behind. By the summer of 1941, the happy time was ending. U-boat losses began to climb. In March, U-99 and U-100, two of the most successful boats of the entire war, were both sunk by British escorts using the new tactics and technologies. Otto Kretschmer was captured. Joachim Schepp was killed when U-100 was rammed by HMS Vanoc. These were not rookie commanders making foolish mistakes. These were the veterans, the aces, the men who had perfected the art of submarine warfare. And they were dying. The Wolf Pack had transformed the Battle of the Atlantic. It had brought Britain to the edge of starvation. It had sunk millions of tons of shipping. It had killed thousands of merchant sailors. But it had also revealed a fundamental truth that Admiral Dönitz had understood from the beginning, but which the younger commanders were only now coming to appreciate. The submarine was a weapon of attrition, not of annihilation. It could kill, it could disrupt, it could delay, but it could not win, not unless it could sink ships faster than they could be built, not unless it could kill sailors faster than they could be trained to replace the dead, not unless it could maintain the advantage of surprise, of stealth, of striking from darkness without warning. And that advantage was slipping away. The U-boats had suddenly been everywhere. They had appeared like wolves among sheep, and for a season, a terrible, bloody season, the sheep had been defenseless. But sheep could learn, sheep could adapt, sheep could grow teeth. In the cold mathematics of industrial warfare, Germany had won spectacular tactical victories but was losing the strategic battle. Britain was building ships faster than U-boats could sink them. The United States was ramping up production of escort vessels and patrol aircraft. Convoys were being rerouted based on intelligence, not just from captured Enigma materials, but from improved radio direction finding, and from the simple, hard-won experience of learning where the wolf packs concentrated. The hunted were learning to avoid the hunters. And there was another factor that few of the U-boat crews fully understood in 1941, though they would come to know it intimately in the years ahead. America's industrial capacity was so vast, so overwhelming, so fundamentally different in scale from anything Germany could match, that once it was fully mobilized for war, the outcome was inevitable. In 1941, American shipyards were launching a new Liberty ship, 10,000 tons of cargo capacity, every 70 days. By 1943, they would be launching one every day, then more than one per day. The equation was simple and brutal. Germany could not sink ships as fast as America could build them. The wolf packs had not failed. They had succeeded beyond all reasonable expectation given the tiny force available. They had adapted. They had innovated. They had proven that coordinated submarine tactics could achieve results far beyond what individual boats could accomplish. But they had also revealed their own limitations. The ocean was vast, but it was not infinite. Sooner or later, the wolves would run out of darkness to hide in. By the spring of 1943, the Battle of the Atlantic reached its climax. In May alone, Germany lost 41 U-boats, more in a single month than in the entire first year of the war. Dönitz, now Grand Admiral and Commander-in-Chief of the entire Kriegsmarine, was forced to withdraw his submarines from the North Atlantic convoy routes. The wolf packs were broken. The tide had turned. Werner Hartmann survived the war. U-47 did not. It was lost with all hands in March of 1941, cause unknown, possibly sunk by a British escort, possibly lost to mechanical failure or accident. Of the 1,155 U-boats commissioned during World War II, 784 were lost. Of the roughly 40,000 men who served in the U-boat force, approximately 30,000 died. It was the highest casualty rate of any branch of any military in the entire war. 3 out of every 4 U-boat crewmen did not survive. What they had hoped to find was glory. What they found instead was an ocean larger than their ambition, and an enemy whose capacity for production and innovation exceeded their own. They found that technological superiority was temporary, that tactical advantages could be countered, that surprise could only be achieved once. They found that war was not the romantic struggle of their imagination, but a grinding contest of industrial systems and logistical networks, where individual courage mattered far less than the number of ships a nation could build and the speed at which it could replace losses. The wolf pack made the Allied convoys suddenly vulnerable, but only for a season, only until the shepherds learned to fight back. In the end, the lesson of the happy time was not about submarines or tactics or technology. It was about adaptation, about resilience, about the difference between winning battles and winning wars. The U-boats had perfected a method of killing, but killing was not enough. Victory required not just destroying what the enemy had, but preventing him from replacing what was destroyed. And that was something the wolf packs could never achieve. The Atlantic is vast and cold and cares nothing for the ambitions of men. It accepts all offerings, steel and flesh, oil and blood, with perfect indifference. The convoys that sailed those waters carried more than cargo. They carried the stubborn insistence that trade routes would remain open, that islands would be fed, that democracies would not be starved into submission. They carried the promise that mass production and technological innovation and sheer, bloody-minded persistence would ultimately overwhelm any tactical brilliance. The wolf packs had their season of darkness, but dawn always comes. And when it came, the wolves discovered they had been hunting in a shrinking shadow, while all around them the world was learning to see in the dark.